Listen. I am Mama Otomba, and I have lived long enough in Harlem to know that the city breathes differently when the night decides to remember something it was never meant to keep. I came to Lenox Avenue in the winter of 1954, when the snow fell soft like crushed bone and the jazz clubs were louder than the prayers of the churches, and I carried with me the old knowledge my grandmother buried into my tongue before I ever learned English properly. Back home, in the red dust lands where the wind speaks like broken drums, we learned that spirits do not cross oceans without reason. And when they do, they arrive hungry. Harlem was supposed to be my refuge, a place where black voices could rise like horns in a smoky club. But I soon learned that even in music there are shadows that listen. I worked in a small apartment above a nightclub called the Blue Casket, where the saxophone player, a man named Elijah Crow, could make notes that sounded like grief remembering its own name. Every night I would sit by my window and watch the dancers below move like possessed saints, their bodies bending under the weight of rhythms that did not belong entirely to this world. It was on a night like that, when the snow began to fall too early and too still, that I first heard the whisper of my ancestors in the steam rising from the streets. They did not speak in words but in pressure, in memory, in the way the wind pressed against my bones like fingers searching for a pulse. I lit my small iron bowl, the one I had brought wrapped in cloth from across the ocean, and I placed dried herbs inside herbs that should not have survived the journey, but did as if something had chosen them for a purpose I did not yet understand. The moment the smoke rose, the music from the Blue Casket changed, just slightly, like a man shifting in his sleep before a nightmare fully claims him. I knew then that something had entered Harlem that did not belong to the rhythm of jazz or the prayers of the living. I stepped down into the street, my coat wrapped tight, and the snow under my feet made no sound, which was the first sign that the night had begun to lie. On Lenox Avenue, I saw men laughing outside the club, but their breath did not fog the air, and their laughter did not echo, as if sound itself had become afraid to travel too far. I remember seeing Elijah Crow standing beneath the neon sign, his saxophone case open at his feet, staring at the snow as though it were speaking to him in a language he almost understood. He looked at me, and for a moment I saw not his eyes but something behind them, something vast and old, like the desert spirits my grandmother warned me about, the ones that travel through silence rather than sound. I wanted to turn back, but the ground beneath Lenox Avenue began to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat trapped under stone, and I understood that whatever had come to Harlem had chosen that street as its mouth. I whispered a prayer in the old tongue, the one that tastes like iron and smoke, and the snow around me stopped falling for a single breathless moment, as if the city itself was listening. Then the first drop of red fell, not from the sky, but from nowhere at all, staining the white ground like memory bleeding through fabric, and I knew the night had truly begun to remember us. I remember how the people outside the Blue Casket did not notice at first, because Harlem has always been a place where strange things are forced to wear the mask of normality, where even sorrow learns to dance so it is not questioned. But I saw it spread across the street in slow hesitation, like something testing whether the world would resist it. Elijah's face tightened as if he could hear a second melody beneath the first, and he stepped backward into the doorway of the club as though the threshold might protect him from what was coming. But thresholds are only illusions when spirits decide to walk openly. The neon sign flickered above us, and in that flicker, I saw something impossible, a silhouette standing inside the snowfall itself, tall and thin, like a man but not shaped by any human memory, its edges dissolving and reforming with every beat of the distant saxophone. My grandmother once told me that there are beings that feed not on flesh but on rhythm, on repetition, on the loops of suffering that humans call history, and in that moment I understood why she never wanted me to come to America. The red in the snow deepened, and I knew it was not blood in the way men understand blood, but something older, something like the color of beginnings that were interrupted too many times. Elijah finally spoke my name, though I had never told it to him, and his voice carried the sound of a man standing at the edge of a dream he cannot wake from. I felt the iron bowl in my pocket grow warm, as if recognizing the presence of something that should have remained buried beneath desert stone and ancestral warnings, and I realized then that whatever had crossed into Harlem had crossed because it had been called, even if no living mouth had spoken the summons aloud. I knew in that moment that calling is never always spoken with the mouth, because some calls are written into sorrow itself. Into the way a people survive too many winters in a place that never fully wants them, and Harlem has always carried that kind of silent summoning like perfume on skin that cannot be washed away. I stepped closer to Elijah Crow even as the red in the snow deepened into something that seemed to pulse under the street, like veins beneath thin skin. And he was trembling now, though the jazz from inside the Blue Casket continued as if nothing outside had the authority to interrupt it. The saxophone notes leaked through the door like smoke, bending strangely in the air, and I understood that music itself was being pulled, stretched, tested by something that did not belong to any instrument made by human hands. Elijah whispered again, not speaking to me, but to whatever stood behind the snowfall, and he said it was here again, the thing in the in-between, the thing that listens through rhythm and answers through hunger. And when he said again, I knew this was not its first visit to him, or to this city. The neon sign above us flickered harder now, buzzing like an insect caught between worlds. And in that unstable light, I saw more clearly the silhouette inside the snow, not fully formed, but always becoming as if it could not decide whether it wanted to exist in our world or remain a thought pressed too hard against reality. I reached into my coat and pressed my fingers against the iron bowl, feeling the warmth rise as the herbs inside reacted to something unseen, and I began to speak softly, in the old tongue my grandmother gave me, not as words but as alignment, as if sound could stitch a tear in the fabric of night. The snow around my feet stopped again, not falling this time but hovering, suspended like breath held too long, and I realized the city itself was listening through every drain, every brick, every cracked window of Lenox Avenue. Elijah dropped his saxophone case, and the sound it made when it hit the ground echoed too long, stretching beyond normal resonance, and I saw his reflection in the club window split for a moment into two versions of himself. One standing and one already half dissolved into the red snow. I asked him what he had done, but he shook his head violently, as if the truth itself was something too large to carry inside speech, and instead he said the music was not his head, that it never had been, that he only borrowed it the way a desperate man borrows fire from a forbidden altar. Then the door of the Blue Casket opened wider, without anyone touching it, and the sound of the saxophone inside changed key, without warning, collapsing into a deeper, older tone that made my teeth ache as if my bones recognized it before my mind did. I felt then the presence of my ancestors, not above me, but behind me, not arriving but already here, waiting for me to notice. They had been standing in Harlem all along, hidden inside steam, inside jazz breaks, inside the spaces between footsteps on wet pavement. The red snow began to rise upward instead of falling, reversing itself like time, losing confidence in its direction. And in that impossible motion I saw images buried inside it. Fragments of deserts, of cracked earth, of tall, thin figures moving through sandstorms, without leaving footprints. And I understood this was not a local spirit, but something that had traveled through suffering across continents, to find a sound it could feed on. Elijah suddenly grabbed my wrist with a strength that did not belong to his thin musician's hands, and his eyes were no longer fully human, reflecting the red snow like polished stone. And he said, it wants the city to become a record. It can play forever a loop of pain. It can spin until meaning dissolves into rhythm alone. I pulled my wrist away and placed the iron bowl between us, and when I did, the air itself tightened, as if the object recognized ownership older than language, and the herbs inside sparked faintly like embers remembering fire. I told him that nothing feeds forever unless it is allowed to, and that even spirits from the oldest deserts fear interruption. But as I spoke, I felt uncertainty crawling through the edges of my voice, because whatever stood in the snow was not behaving like anything my grandmother had prepared me for. The silhouette outside grew taller, or perhaps closer, and the streetlights along Lenox Avenue bent slightly, as if leaning away from it, and the people still outside the Blue Casket finally began to notice that their reactions were slow, delayed, like reality itself buffering. A woman dropped her purse, and the sound of it hitting the ground came 3 times, not once, and that was when she began to scream, though no sound fully escaped her mouth, as if the night had decided speech required permission. I felt the iron bowl grow cold suddenly, not empty, but listening in a different way, and I understood then that whatever had come was not only feeding but learning, adapting to the rhythms of Harlem, taking jazz and sorrow and rhythm and trying to translate them into something endless. Elijah collapsed to his knees, pressing his hands into the red snow, as if trying to hold it down, and he began to whisper. Names I did not recognize. Names that tasted like sand and broken drums and long journeys without return, and I realized those were not his memories, but something speaking through him, using his mouth as a borrowed instrument. The snow rose higher, surrounding us now at knee level, and in its surface I saw my own reflection distort and age and multiply, as if every possible version of my life was being tested for weakness. I understood then that Harlem was not the target but the amplifier, that the Blue Casket was not a club but a tuning fork, and that Elijah Crow was not merely a musician, but a conduit through which something ancient had learned how to hum in a new world. And as the night tightened around us like a closing hand, I knew I would have to choose not how to stop what was coming, but how much of myself I was willing to let it hear before it learned my shape too well. I knew then that fear was no longer useful to me, because fear is only a language the living use before they learn the deeper grammar of survival. And what stood in Lenox Avenue that night was already writing its own grammar across the sky. The red snow had risen to my waist, now moving like it had weight and intention, and the sound of the Blue Casket behind us had become warped into something like a record played on broken glass, repeating fragments of notes that no longer belonged to any human composition. Elijah Crow was still on his knees, but now he was no longer fully present in his body, his mouth moving as if he were counting something ancient and vast. And I understood that the thing inside the snow was using him as a metronome, measuring itself into our world through his collapsing identity. I closed my eyes for a moment, and I let the voices of my ancestors come forward, not as whispers this time, but as pressure against my entire being, and I felt them standing in a circle that stretched beyond Harlem, beyond the ocean, beyond even the desert where their memory began, and they told me without words that this thing was not a spirit in the way we understand spirits, but a hunger that had learned to imitate divinity by consuming repetition. I opened my iron bowl, and for the first time since I left my homeland, I did not ask for permission, I commanded, and the herbs inside ignited, without fire, releasing a scent that carried both beginning and ending at once. And the red snow recoiled, as if it had tasted something it remembered fearing. The street around us cracked faintly like old porcelain, and beneath it I could feel the pulse of Harlem itself. Not the buildings or the people, but the accumulated rhythm of every song, ever played in every club, every sorrow sung in every church, every step taken by those who refused to disappear quietly. And I realized that Harlem had always been a sealed drum waiting for the right hand to strike it back into awareness. I began to sing then in the old language, not loudly but precisely, shaping each syllable like a blade that cuts without tearing, and the air responded by thinning, sharpening, becoming aware of itself as separate from the thing inside the snow. Elijah screamed suddenly, but it was not pain, it was recognition. As if something inside him had been released from a loop it had been trapped in for too long, and I saw the silhouette in the snowfall flicker for the first time in hesitation. The red snow rose higher still, but it no longer advanced with certainty, and I stepped forward into it, letting it touch my skin, and it was cold like history that refuses to be forgiven. But I did not retreat, because I understood that anything that feeds on rhythm must eventually face interruption or collapse into silence. I raised the iron bowl above my head, and I spoke the name of my grandmother, not as memory but as authority, and in that moment the snow stopped entirely, suspended between falling and rising, as if the night itself had forgotten which direction it was supposed to believe in. The silhouette outside Lenox Avenue condensed for the first time into something almost human, almost man-shaped, but its edges were still made of borrowed sound and stolen breath. And it tried to speak through the jazz still leaking from the Blue Casket, trying to reshape itself using the language of horns and pianion. But I countered it with silence, learned from the desert, where even wind must ask permission to move sand. Elijah collapsed fully, then no longer possessed, no longer a conduit. Just a man emptied of something that had mistaken him for a doorway, and I knelt beside him for a moment, because even in war against the unseen, the living must still be tended. I placed my hand over the red snow and I let it see me fully, not as fear but as boundary, and I told it in the old tongue that Harlem is not a vessel for endless hunger, that music here belongs to those who suffer it and create it, not to something that consumes it without end. And the snow began to darken, losing its unnatural brightness. The silhouette shuddered as if it were hearing a truth it had never been spoken to before. And I understood then that it had traveled so far across deserts and histories, because no one had ever refused it properly, no one had ever named its limitation. I repeated the refusal again and again until my voice was no longer mine, but the accumulation of every ancestor who ever survived by saying no, in a world that demanded silence. And slowly the red began to drain from the snow as if it were bleeding back into whatever impossible place it had come from. The streets of Lenox Avenue returned gradually to themselves, though scarred, as if memory had pressed too hard against reality and left marks that would not fade quickly, and the jazz from the Blue Casket resumed its natural form, though quieter now, as if the instruments themselves understood they had been overheard by something too large. Elijah opened his eyes and looked at me as if seeing the world for the first time without interference, and I knew he would never fully forget what had used him, but he would also never again belong to it. The silhouette finally dissolved, not defeated like a man, but interrupted like a thought that loses coherence before becoming action, and the last of the red snow fell once more as ordinary white flakes, ashamed perhaps, or simply returned to what it had been before it learned too much. I closed the iron bowl and the night settled into itself again, Harlem breathing through broken neon and distant saxophone, like a city pretending it had never almost been rewritten. And as I carried Elijah back toward the warmth of the Blue Casket, I understood that this place would always attract things that feed on rhythm, but it would also always produce voices strong enough to break the loop. Because Harlem is not just a street or a city or a sound, it is a refusal that keeps learning how to speak louder than whatever tries to silence it. And I, Mama Otomba, remain here not as witness alone but as reminder that even the oldest hunger can be taught the meaning of enough.